The fancy way of saying this is sources of finance. The real way of saying it is ways of getting money. This is why they wouldn't trust me to write the syllabus for business studies, because it'd be about a quarter of the length and full of swear words anyway. But it would be much simpler. The ways of getting money for a business are what we call the sources of finance. The basic thing that you need to remember is that money is not free. You can't just get money from nowhere. You are going to have to pay something for every source of finance. Every source of finance is going to have some sort of costs, whether it's interest payments for debt for loans, or dividend payments if you get money from shareholders. The money is not free. You can't just get money for free. Even though you probably can in illegal ways and all that sort of stuff. But you're not going to get money for free and actually be able to go through and ATO audit. So the syllabus has internal sources of finance and external sources of finance. And really the only internal source of finance that they identify are retained profits, so profits from last year that the business has kept. The external sources of finance is a great big long list, and the way that I've done the syllabus and color-coded everything should make it easier for you to remember. You've basically got equity sources and debt sources. The equity sources are ordinary shares, and there's a whole bunch of different types of ordinary shares, new issues, rights issues, and we go into each of those in a little while. And private equity, which is a real growth industry. Well, it was I guess before the global financial crisis, but private equity is becoming a pretty popular way to get money for businesses, and it's also an ethical issue in some sense, because they can do nasty things. Debt sources include short-term borrowing, so overdrafts and factoring. Those are short-term solutions, so short-term sources of finance. And long-term borrowing, which obviously mortgages are the first thing that pops into your mind, but debentures and unsecured notes are not things that pop into your mind. So you need to memorize the syllabus as it is. The nicer way and the simpler way of putting all of these is just to have a simple diagram where you've got internal, so in the inside level there, internal source of finance, so equity, retained profits. Then outside of that, you've got external equity, so private equity and issuing shares, which are still sources of equity, but they're from outside the business. So if you invite new shareholders, those are new people. They're not already inside the business. So the money is coming from external to the business. So internal would be only retained profits, external, any other type of equity. But then you also have the red level, the external level of debt, which includes short-term and long-term. So this is a diagram that you can actually draw in the exam. If you're asked, say in section 3, you're asked, work out some sources of finance, recommend some sources of finance for this business, you would probably need to go through all the different sources of finance just briefly. And what you can do, you can even draw this as part of your planning for the essay, and make sure that you've covered each of them. So you should be able to just stare at that for long enough. And then just practice, drawing it again and again and again and again, because that's really the only way you're going to memorize these things. So starting with the internal sources of finance, which is what this part is about, and then we look at the external in the next video. The internal sources of finance only, include retained profits, and that's not reality, but that's what the syllabus is saying. So internal means from within the business, and retained profits are profits that are kept. They're not distributed to the shareholders. Instead, they're reinvested back into the business. So Apple has had, a long history of doing this, where they announce, some record profit, some, multi-billion-dollar profit, and then the shareholders go, "Oh, right, we're going to get this money, we're going to get the money, we're going to get dividends." And Apple says, "Actually, we're just going to keep it. We're going to put it in the bank," and they ended up with 80-something billion dollars just sitting in the bank. And they eventually decided, look, it's probably better that we do share this, but they thought it was necessary because they had all sorts of things, all sorts of plans to expand, plus they had all these legal challenges all around the world that they needed to deal with. So having a war chest of $80 billion for the business was the best thing for the business in their minds. So the shareholders, for just about any other business, wouldn't put up with that. They just sell the shares. They go, "Look, I haven't had a dividend for 5 years. I'm just going to sell these shares. I'm going to buy something that is actually going to give me a dividend all the time." But because of Apple's growth and the popularity entirety of Apple, they were actually able to just keep getting those retained profits so that they didn't need to, borrow large sums from all different places. They had huge amounts of money in the bank. They retained their profits. They kept them. Something that will help you in any exam question, really, especially that Section 3 question, especially when you're looking at recommending a source of finance for a business, are the advantages and disadvantages. And so throughout the app, I've got advantages and disadvantages, advantages in green, disadvantages in red, and very, very simply so that you can actually memorize these advantages and disadvantages. They're not hidden in some giant paragraph and you have to try to work out what's an advantage and what's a disadvantage. The advantages of retained profits obviously doesn't increase your debt levels because you're using money that you've already made. There's no new shareholders, so that means that if you're, worried about how much your shareholders are going to get in terms of their dividends next year, you don't need to get new shareholders that you need to share the profits with. So the ownership of the business isn't diluted like that. And because it's retained profits, because it's an internal source of finance, it's not because it's equity, there's no interest payments. So it's a really, really good source of finance. However, there are some disadvantages. Firstly, it's pretty limited. Unless you're actually making enormous profits every year, you can't just use retained profits, right? The other disadvantage, and something that's often overlooked, is that it might get wasted. Not wasted as in you're going to get wasted after you finish HSC. It might get wasted in that, well, look, we made, $1 million profit last year. We didn't give it out to the shareholders. We're just going to use it. But you are usually going to be much more careful with somebody else's money that you have to pay back than with your own money that you don't have to pay back. So it might get wasted in that sense. And that's something that was picked up in the Creative Business Studies book. And I've recommended that before. But it really is the best textbook for the subject. I know, it's not the one that your teacher might use or whatever, but it is the right choice, really. And no, I'm not getting paid for it or anything like that. It's just something that's really underused and underrated, and I don't know why people don't use it more. But yeah, that's something that he picks up on that other textbooks don't really pick up on, is that it can get wasted. We also need to look at the external sources of finance, which we look at in the next video.